The cruelest laughter is always spoken a heartbeat before destiny changes the room. The great glass dome of Belgrave Conservatory shimmered beneath hundreds of candle flames, each reflection dancing across polished marble and the still surface of the ornamental pool at its center, while winter rain whispered against the towering panes overhead. Guests in silk and velvet drifted through fragrant orange trees and blooming white camellias as a string quartet filled the air with graceful melodies, every smile polished, every greeting rehearsed, every glance quietly measuring rank and fortune. Among gowns stitched with silver thread and necklaces worth entire estates stood Lillian Brooks, her ivory dress simple by comparison, carefully altered with her own hands until every seam rested perfectly despite the modest fabric. She carried herself with calm dignity, neither shrinking beneath curious eyes nor pretending to belong somewhere she had not earned. Her late father had taught her that true grace never depended upon titles, only upon character, and even after his passing those words remained stitched into her heart more securely than any embroidery on her gown. Across the conservatory, whispers followed her gentle movements. Some remembered the surveyor who had served the Ashford lands faithfully for decades. Others remembered only that his daughter possessed no noble lineage. To them she was an unwelcome curiosity standing among people who believed privilege alone could define worth. Lady Madeline Crane watched from beneath an elegant crystal chandelier, her smile thin as she accepted another glass of deep red wine from a passing servant. Beside her stood Rebecca Vance, whose eager laughter rarely waited for permission. "She certainly has courage," Rebecca murmured with mocking amusement. "Or remarkable ignorance." Madeline's eyes lingered on Lillian with cold precision. "Tonight she will remember exactly where she belongs." Lillian noticed their approach long before they reached her, yet she remained where she stood beside the quiet pool, admiring white camellias blooming beneath the glass roof despite the storm outside. Their fragile beauty reminded her that even harsh winters could shelter unexpected life. "Miss Brooks," Madeline said sweetly. "How delightful to see you enjoying an evening meant for distinguished company." Lillian offered a courteous nod. "Lady Crane, I hope the evening has treated you kindly." "Far more kindly than it has treated you, I imagine." Madeline stepped closer with practiced elegance, pretending to adjust the folds of her own skirt before suddenly turning her shoulder. The crystal goblet tipped. Rich crimson wine splashed across Lillian's ivory bodice and flowed down the front of her dress in slow scarlet ribbons. A chorus of startled gasps echoed beneath the vaulted glass ceiling. For one suspended moment no one moved. Then Rebecca laughed. "Oh dear!" she exclaimed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "What a terrible accident!" Before Lillian could even reach for her handkerchief, Rebecca lifted her own glass with theatrical concern. "Perhaps this will make the colors match." Another wave of dark wine struck the lower half of Lillian's gown, staining the pale fabric until crimson spread like autumn leaves across fresh snow. Laughter rippled through clusters of young nobles, hesitant at first, then bolder as no voice challenged the cruelty unfolding before them. One gentleman smirked behind his champagne flute, while another lady whispered that plain dresses were easier to replace than proper manners. Lillian lowered her eyes only long enough to study the spreading stains before calmly removing a neatly folded linen handkerchief from her sleeve. Her fingers trembled once, almost imperceptibly, but her breathing never faltered. She gently pressed the cloth against the fabric without urgency, refusing to reward anyone with tears. Madeline extended a lace handkerchief of her own, her expression coated in false sympathy. "Please," she said softly, "allow me to help. It would be dreadful if everyone remembered you this way." Lillian looked at the offered lace, then quietly returned her attention to the worn linen embroidered years earlier with her father's initials. "Thank you," she answered with serene composure. "But I already have everything I need." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Pride is such an expensive luxury for someone in your position." Madeline smiled toward the gathering audience. "One cannot expect refinement from every household." A few more voices chuckled. Lillian finally lifted her gaze, her emerald eyes steady despite the crimson stains across her dress. "My father taught me something different," she said gently. "A title may open a door, But only character decides how someone behaves once they walk through it. The laughter weakened. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Even those who had smiled moments before found themselves unable to meet her calm expression. Madeline felt the room shifting and her polished smile tighten almost invisibly. She had expected humiliation, not quiet strength. Hidden beyond a row of fragrant orange trees at the edge of the conservatory, a tall man dressed in black had witnessed every word, every drop of wine, and every heartbeat of silence. His hand closed around a small velvet box resting inside his coat pocket as gray eyes fixed upon the woman standing alone beneath the sea of candlelight, and Duke Grant Ashford realized with absolute certainty that the choice he had made weeks ago would no longer remain a secret before this night was over. Lillian continued dabbing the crimson stains with the old linen handkerchief until the cloth itself carried more red than white. Around her, conversation slowly resumed, but the laughter had changed. It no longer sounded carefree. It carried the uneasy edge of people wondering whether they had witnessed entertainment, or revealed something unpleasant about themselves. Madeline noticed the hesitation spreading through the gathering and refused to surrender control of the evening. She stepped closer with measured elegance, her jeweled bracelet catching the candlelight as though even the room had chosen to admire her. "You always did possess remarkable confidence, Miss Brooks," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Confidence often visits those who mistake kindness for acceptance." Lillian folded the handkerchief carefully before slipping it back into her sleeve. "Kindness never needs to announce itself," she answered quietly. "It simply exists." A faint murmur drifted through the nearby guests. An elderly widow lowered her gaze with visible discomfort, while a young gentleman shifted awkwardly, suddenly fascinated by the marble floor beneath his polished shoes. Madeline could almost feel sympathy beginning to bloom where ridicule had flourished only moments before, and sympathy was dangerous. Sympathy could become respect. She refused to allow that transformation. "Perhaps," Madeline replied smoothly, "your father neglected to teach another valuable lesson. Certain doors remain closed regardless of how politely one knocks." Lillian met her gaze without bitterness. "Then perhaps those rooms were never worth entering." Rebecca released a short laugh, louder than necessary. "Listen to her. She speaks as though she belongs among us." Lillian answered with the same calm expression. "I belong wherever I choose honesty over fear." The words settled over the conservatory like fresh snow. They were not spoken with anger or pride. They were spoken as simple truth, and truth often carried more weight than accusation. Hidden beyond the fragrant orange trees, Grant Ashford remained perfectly still. Every instinct urged him to step forward, to end the spectacle before another cruel remark reached her ears, yet something deeper restrained him. During the lonely years following his father's death, he had learned that character revealed itself most clearly when no rescue seemed certain. He had wondered whether Lillian's quiet reputation had been exaggerated by grateful tenants and loyal servants. Now, watching her stand beneath the immense glass ceiling with wine staining her dress while refusing to surrender her dignity, every lingering doubt disappeared. She neither begged for approval nor sought revenge. She defended only her principles. His fingers tightened around the velvet ring box resting inside his coat. The family heirloom had belonged to his mother, a woman remembered throughout Derbyshire not because she had carried the title of Duchess, but because every stable hand and every child in the village had spoken her name with genuine affection. Grant had spent years believing no one could ever honor that legacy again. Tonight he realized he had been mistaken. Meanwhile, Madeline glanced discreetly toward the musicians, then toward Lord Owen Prescott standing near one of the marble columns. Their eyes met for less than a heartbeat. It was enough. Owen offered the slightest nod before disappearing into the crowd exactly as they had planned earlier that evening. Rebecca noticed the silent exchange and relaxed. The spilled wine had only been the beginning. Their true design had never depended upon humiliation alone. Reputation, once stained, could sometimes recover. Accusation was far more difficult to erase. Lillian sensed movement around her without understanding its purpose. A young servant hurried past carrying an empty silver tray. Another quietly closed one of the conservatory doors against the strengthening rain outside. Somewhere beyond the towering camellias, thunder rolled softly across the hills surrounding Belgrave Estate. She drew a slow breath, reminding herself that storms always passed eventually. What she did not know was that another storm had already begun moving through the room, carefully arranged by hands hidden behind courteous smiles. Grant watched Owen disappear among the guests, and recognized the calculated rhythm immediately. Nothing about the evening felt accidental anymore. The spilled wine, the rehearsed laughter, the carefully timed whispers, all of it fit together too neatly. He lifted his eyes toward Lillian once more. She still believed the worst had already happened. He feared it had not yet begun. 6 weeks earlier, Belgrave Estate had looked nothing like the glittering world now reflected beneath its towering glass roof. The first frost had settled across the hills of Derbyshire, leaving every blade of grass edged with silver as a sharp morning wind swept through the tenant cottages beyond the main grounds. Lillian Brooks walked the narrow lane carrying a basket filled with bread, dried herbs, and neatly folded blankets that had been donated by families who possessed little more than those receiving them. She greeted each neighbor with the same quiet warmth, never lingering long enough to receive thanks. There was always another door waiting, another child shivering beside a cold fireplace, another elderly couple pretending they had already eaten so younger mouths could have the last loaf. When she reached the final cottage, she found 3 frightened children standing outside while smoke drifted from a storage shed nearby. Several ledgers and bundles of documents had been hurriedly carried into the damp yard before the smoke could spread further. Without hesitation, Lillian gathered the scattered books and protected them beneath her own cloak before the light rain could destroy months of harvest records. By the time the estate workers arrived with buckets of water, the small fire had already burned itself out, leaving little damage behind except blackened timber and frightened faces. Moments later, a dark carriage stopped beside the muddy lane. Duke Grant Ashford stepped onto the wet ground wearing a heavy charcoal coat, his expression unreadable as his steward quietly explained that the damaged records contained rental agreements and winter supply accounts for nearly every tenant family on the western fields. Grant's eyes settled upon the young woman kneeling in the mud, carefully separating damp pages so the ink would not bleed together. He assumed she had acted only to protect estate property until one of the elderly farmers shook his head. "Those books were never her concern, Your Grace," the old man said softly. "She saved them because if they disappeared, innocent families might lose proof of what they already paid." Grant studied Lillian more closely. Her sleeves were stained with dirt, strands of chestnut hair had escaped beneath her bonnet, and her hands were chilled from the rain, yet she never once looked toward him hoping for praise. Instead, she continued arranging the ledgers before quietly asking the steward whether every family would still receive coal deliveries despite the confusion. The question surprised him. Most people first protected themselves. She immediately thought of others. Later that afternoon, Grant reviewed the restored records inside the estate office. Something did not feel right. Numbers failed to match grain inventories, relief funds had vanished from several accounts, and signatures appeared strangely inconsistent. Before he could summon the estate manager, Lillian requested permission to speak. She entered the office without fear, carrying one additional ledger she had discovered beneath the damaged shelves. "I believe this belongs with the others," she said. Grant accepted the worn book and opened it. Several missing transactions suddenly made sense. Money intended for struggling tenant families had quietly disappeared through false reimbursements authorized by officials whose names appeared respectable on paper. Grant lifted his eyes. "You understand these records?" Lillian nodded gently. "My father taught me bookkeeping because he believed every honest estate depends upon honest numbers." Grant asked why she had never reported the discrepancies earlier. She answered with complete sincerity. "I needed proof before accusing anyone. Suspicion without evidence only creates another injustice." The words remained with him long after she had left the office. Over the following weeks he found unexpected reasons to visit the western cottages, the herb garden near the old chapel, and the modest schoolroom where Lillian volunteered to teach children whose parents could not afford tutors. Each visit confirmed the same truth. She accepted gratitude with embarrassment, corrected mistakes without humiliation, and spoke to every laborer with the same respect she offered visiting clergy. Never once did she flatter him because of his title. Never once did she ask for favor, money, or influence. On the evening before the winter gala, Grant finally opened the velvet box that had belonged to his mother. As candlelight rested upon the family ring, he quietly instructed his solicitor to prepare the documents that would begin a new chapter for House Ashford, believing the greatest decision of his life had already been made long before anyone entered the conservatory beneath the glass roof. The soft music faltered almost unnoticed as another voice suddenly rose above the quiet conversations. "My necklace is gone." Lady Wexford stood near the marble staircase with one gloved hand pressed against her throat where a magnificent diamond necklace had rested only moments earlier. The elegant laughter that had slowly returned after the earlier embarrassment disappeared again, replaced by uneasy whispers spreading beneath the vast glass dome. Guests instinctively looked toward one another before servants hurried across the polished floor with anxious expressions. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the towering windows while candlelight shimmered across the ornamental pool, making every reflection seem uncertain. Madeline Crane lowered her eyes with practiced concern, though satisfaction flickered behind them for only the briefest instant. Lord Owen Prescott stepped forward with measured confidence. "No one has left the conservatory," he observed. "Surely this is only a misunderstanding, but perhaps we should search the room before panic spreads." Several guests nodded immediately. Others hesitated, unwilling to offend anyone yet unwilling to ignore the missing jewelry. Lillian remained exactly where she stood, her ivory gown still marked by crimson stains that had begun to dry against the fabric. She quietly watched the growing commotion without speaking. Rebecca Vance folded her hands together with exaggerated sympathy. "It would be unfortunate if suspicion lingered over innocent people," she said sweetly. "A simple inspection would protect everyone's reputation." One by one, guests willingly opened their evening bags and surrendered shawls and gloves for examination. Jewel cases, embroidered purses, and delicate wraps revealed nothing unusual. Owen slowly turned toward Lillian with carefully disguised reluctance. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "I am certain you understand why we must be thorough." Every eye in the conservatory shifted toward her. Lillian looked from one face to another before calmly lifting the small cloth satchel she had carried throughout the evening. "You may look," she replied. A nearby servant accepted the bag respectfully and loosened the drawstrings. For one suspended heartbeat nothing happened. Then a glitter of brilliant diamonds caught the candlelight. Lady Wexford gasped. Her missing necklace rested inside Lillian's satchel. Silence swept through the conservatory with greater force than any shout. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Lillian stared at the necklace without moving. Confusion crossed her face before disbelief quietly settled into her expression. She knew with complete certainty that she had never seen the piece before that moment. Lady Wexford looked deeply shaken rather than angry. "How could this be?" she whispered. Before Lillian could answer, Madeline released a sorrowful sigh. "I prayed we would not find it there." Rebecca lowered her eyes as though she wished to spare Lillian further embarrassment. "Desperation makes even good people lose themselves sometimes." Several guests who had begun admiring Lillian's composure only minutes earlier now exchanged uncertain glances. Whispers returned, softer than before but far more dangerous. One lady murmured that financial hardship could tempt anyone. Another quietly remarked that appearances often deceived. Lillian closed her satchel after the servant handed it back. Her hands remained steady despite the weight of countless suspicious eyes. She slowly lifted her head toward Lady Wexford. "My lady," she said with quiet sincerity, "I have never taken anything that was not freely given. I cannot explain why your necklace appeared in my bag, but I can promise it was not placed there by my hands." Owen folded his arms. "Unfortunately, promises cannot outweigh evidence." Madeline stepped closer with graceful concern. "No one wishes to humiliate you further, Miss Brooks. If you quietly leave Belgrave tonight, perhaps this unhappy misunderstanding can remain private." The words floated through the room like a generous offer, yet beneath them lay unmistakable triumph. Lillian understood exactly what was being demanded. She could surrender her dignity to protect herself from deeper scandal, or she could stand alone against a room already prepared to judge her. She drew one slow breath before answering with calm resolve. I will leave this estate only if its master asks me to leave. Until then, I have nothing to confess. Another silence followed, heavier than the first. Then, from beyond the fragrant orange trees where shadows met candlelight, a deep voice broke through the stillness with quiet authority. Then you will not be leaving. Every head turned toward the sound as Duke Grant Ashford stepped from the darkness, his grey eyes fixed not upon the necklace, nor upon the gathered guests, but upon the woman who had refused to surrender her honor when surrender would have been the easier path. Duke Grant Ashford walked forward with unhurried confidence, every measured step echoing softly across the marble floor until the entire conservatory seemed to breathe in perfect silence. No one dared interrupt him. The musicians remained motionless, servants lowered their eyes, and even the rain beyond the towering glass walls appeared gentler, as though the storm itself had paused to witness what would happen next. Grant stopped before Lillian without immediately acknowledging the frightened whispers surrounding them. His gaze settled upon the crimson stains still darkening the front of her ivory dress. The wine had dried unevenly across the delicate fabric, yet it was not the ruined gown that caught his attention. It was the quiet dignity with which she continued to wear it. Miss Brooks, he asked softly enough that only those nearest could hear. Are you hurt? Lillian looked into his steady gray eyes and slowly shook her head. No, Your Grace. Only after hearing those words did Grant remove the long black evening coat from his shoulders. Without ceremony or hesitation, he carefully draped it across hers, shielding the stained fabric beneath its heavy wool. His hands lingered only long enough to settle the coat comfortably before withdrawing again. The gesture contained neither pity nor spectacle. It carried only respect. A faint warmth spread through Lillian despite the chill that had settled inside her since the first splash of wine. She opened her mouth to thank him, but Grant had already turned toward the gathered guests. His expression remained calm, yet something in his eyes caused every conversation to vanish before it could begin. Who, he asked with quiet precision, believed it acceptable to treat a guest beneath my roof in such a manner? No one answered. Madeline Crane finally stepped forward, her smile carefully composed. Your Grace, I deeply regret the unfortunate misunderstanding. We were simply attempting to resolve Lady Wexford's missing necklace. Emotions became rather unsettled. Grant regarded her for several long seconds. I did not ask about the necklace. His voice never rose. I asked who believed humiliation was suitable entertainment inside Belgrave. Rebecca lowered her gaze. Owen Prescott shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Several guests who had laughed earlier suddenly found extraordinary interest in the polished marble beneath their shoes. Grant continued, A joke ends when everyone involved is laughing. Cruelty disguised as amusement remains cruelty. The words settled over the conservatory with unmistakable weight. Lady Wexford stepped forward holding the recovered necklace in trembling hands. Your Grace, I cannot understand how this happened. Grant inclined his head respectfully. Neither can I, my lady. Which is precisely why no conclusions will be reached tonight without truth. He looked toward the chief steward standing near the entrance. Close every gate on the estate. No guest leaves Belgrave until every question has been answered. The steward bowed immediately. Yes, Your Grace. Soft murmurs swept through the room. Madeline's elegant composure faltered for the first time. Surely that is unnecessary, she protested gently. Miss Brooks herself admitted the necklace was found inside her satchel. Grant turned toward her with quiet authority. She admitted only that it was found there. She confessed to nothing. His eyes drifted briefly toward Lillian before returning to the crowd. I have learned through long experience that evidence deserves examination. Assumptions deserve suspicion. Owen folded his hands behind his back. Your Grace, appearances are difficult to ignore, Grant answered without looking away. Appearances have misled wiser men than either of us, Lord Prescott. A deep stillness returned. Lillian felt dozens of eyes upon her, yet for the first time that evening she no longer felt completely alone. Grant had not declared her innocent. He had done something far more meaningful. He had refused to allow judgment before truth. That distinction mattered more than she could explain. Across the room, Madeline watched the careful balance she had constructed begin to shift beyond her control. She had expected Grant to defend the dignity of his household. She had not expected him to defend the dignity of Lillian Brooks. Beneath the shelter of the black coat resting across her shoulders, Lillian quietly steadied her breathing, unaware that the evening had already moved beyond a missing necklace. Somewhere inside the pocket of the coat Grant had just placed around her rested a small velvet box containing the future he had chosen weeks before, while hidden beneath the polished calm of the conservatory. Another secret waited patiently for the moment, when every carefully crafted lie would finally begin to unravel. The heavy doors of the conservatory closed with a deep echo that rolled beneath the towering glass ceiling like distant thunder. Outside, the rain continued to fall across the gardens of Belgrave, but inside, no guests moved toward the exits. Duke Grant Ashford stood at the center of the room with the composed stillness of a man who had already decided that the truth would not escape him. His gaze traveled slowly across every face before resting on the chief steward. "Bring Mr. Ellsworth, the head groundskeeper, and young Thomas from the cloak gallery," he instructed. "There are questions only they can answer." The steward bowed and disappeared through a side corridor. Uneasy whispers drifted through the gathering once again. Madeline Crane maintained her elegant posture, although the fingers resting against her fan tightened ever so slightly. Owen Prescott forced an easy smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your Grace," he began politely, "surely this matter can be settled with discretion. We would not wish to damage an innocent lady's reputation any further." Grant regarded him calmly. "That is precisely why I intend to hear every witness." The answer ended the conversation before it could continue. Minutes later the steward returned with two nervous servants. Mr. Ellsworth, whose weathered face carried decades of loyal service, removed his cap respectfully. Beside him stood Thomas, a young footman no older than 16, his hands trembling as he glanced uncertainly around the room. Grant softened his voice. "Thomas, speak honestly. No one in this room will punish you for telling the truth." The young servant swallowed before answering. "Yes, Your Grace." Grant nodded toward Lillian's satchel. "Did you see anyone near Miss Brooks' belongings this evening?" Thomas hesitated. His eyes instinctively searched the room before stopping on Rebecca Vance. The color drained from his face. Rebecca immediately looked away. "Take your time," Grant said gently. "Only the truth matters here." Thomas drew a slow breath. "I was arranging coats beside the eastern entrance after dinner. Miss Brooks left her satchel on the bench for only a moment, while she helped an elderly guest who nearly slipped near the fountain." Several guests quietly remembered the small incident and nodded. "While she was away," Thomas continued, "Miss Vance walked over. She told me Lady Crane needed assistance in the music gallery and handed me a silver coin to hurry there." Rebecca's expression stiffened. Thomas lowered his eyes. "When I returned less than a minute later, Miss Vance was standing beside the bench. I thought nothing of it until everyone began searching for the necklace." A ripple of astonishment spread through the conservatory. Rebecca quickly lifted her chin. "That proves nothing. I merely admired the flowers nearby." Before anyone could respond, Mr. Ellsworth cleared his throat respectfully. "Your Grace, there is something else." Grant turned toward the old groundskeeper. "Go on." "Earlier this afternoon I was pruning the northern camellias beneath the eastern glass wall. I saw Lord Prescott and Lady Crane speaking together behind the hedges. They stopped talking the moment they noticed me. I remember it because Lady Crane appeared troubled." Owen offered a quiet laugh that sounded carefully rehearsed. "Surely private conversations are not crimes." Grant did not disagree. "No. But they sometimes become important when placed beside other facts." Lillian listened in complete silence, her heart caught between relief and uncertainty. The testimony weakened the accusation against her, Yet she could already feel another story beginning to take shape around her. Madeline recognized the same danger. Before Grant could ask another question, she stepped forward with graceful confidence. "Perhaps we are all overlooking the obvious," she said. "Your Grace has defended Miss Brooks from the moment he entered this room because she is not merely another guest. Everyone in Derbyshire has noticed how often he visits the western cottages these past weeks." Quiet murmurs spread once more. Madeline's smile slowly returned. "Tell us honestly, Your Grace. Are you protecting evidence, or are you protecting the woman?" The question lingered beneath the candlelit glass roof, and for the first time that evening every curious eye turned away from the missing necklace and toward the silent connection neither Grant nor Lillian had ever intended the world to see. Lillian felt the weight of every curious glance settle upon her shoulders, yet she did not turn toward Duke Grant Ashford searching for rescue. She knew that if her name were to survive this evening with honor, it could not rest entirely upon another person's authority, no matter how powerful he might be. She looked once at the diamond necklace resting in Lady Wexford's hands, then slowly extended her own hand. "May I examine it?" she asked quietly. Lady Wexford hesitated only briefly before placing the necklace into Lillian's open palm. The conservatory fell silent once again. Lillian lifted the piece toward the candlelight, studying each delicate clasp with patient attention. Her fingers paused near the small fastening hidden beneath the chain. Something dark clung to the polished gold. She gently rubbed the edge with her thumb before bringing it closer to her eyes. "This is not ordinary soil," she said softly. "It is resin." Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Grant watched without interrupting. "The northern camellia garden was pruned this afternoon," Lillian continued. "The gardeners cut damaged branches after yesterday's windstorm. Fresh resin from those trees leaves this exact dark stain before it hardens." Mr. Ellsworth nodded immediately. "She is correct, Your Grace. Those camellias produce a sticky black resin unlike any other tree on the estate." Lillian carefully returned the necklace to Lady Wexford. "If this necklace was hidden inside my satchel after passing through the camellia garden, then whoever carried it had been there shortly before entering the conservatory." Owen Prescott answered too quickly. "Many people walked through the gardens today." Lillian met his eyes calmly. "Perhaps. But very few would have reason to stand behind the northern hedges where guests rarely visit during winter." A quiet murmur swept across the room. Grant turned toward the steward. "Search the northern camellia beds." Within minutes several servants disappeared into the rain carrying lanterns. No one spoke while they waited. Only the gentle rhythm of rainfall against the glass roof filled the silence. Madeline Crane maintained her graceful smile, but Rebecca Vance's breathing had become noticeably uneven. At last the doors opened again. The steward returned carrying a small leather ledger wrapped inside a cloth to protect it from the rain. Behind him another servant held a velvet jewelry pouch. "Your Grace," the steward announced. "These were discovered beneath a loose stone beside the northern camellias exactly where Miss Brooks described." Grant accepted the ledger and opened it slowly. Several folded letters slipped onto the table beside him. He unfolded the first page, his expression growing colder with every passing line. The ledger contained records of unauthorized payments connected to estate relief funds that had disappeared weeks earlier. The letters revealed private correspondence arranging debts owed by Lord Owen Prescott and promising repayment through valuables removed from wealthy households before false accusations could be directed elsewhere. Owen's face lost all color. Rebecca took an involuntary step backward. Madeline remained silent, though the confidence in her eyes finally began to fade. Grant closed the ledger with deliberate calm. "It appears," he said evenly, "that this investigation has become considerably larger than a missing necklace." Rebecca's composure suddenly shattered. "I never wanted any of this," she cried. "Lady Crane said no one would be harmed. She only wanted Miss Brooks embarrassed so she would leave Belgrave before—" She stopped herself too late. Every eye turned toward Madeline. "Before what?" Grant asked. Rebecca lowered her face into trembling hands. "Before you chose her." A stunned silence settled over the conservatory. Madeline slowly lifted her chin. Very well, she said quietly. Yes, I wanted her gone. Because every person in this room knows what no one dares admit. A duke cannot tie the future of House Ashford to a woman without noble blood and expect society to remain silent. Her words echoed beneath the towering glass roof before fading into stillness. Lillian looked toward Grant, not with hope, but with concern. She feared that defending her now would force him into a conflict far greater than either of them had ever intended. Yet Grant's expression revealed neither hesitation nor uncertainty. Instead, he reached calmly inside the pocket of the black coat resting upon Lillian's shoulders, and his fingers closed around the small velvet box he had carried all evening. Grant Ashford slowly withdrew the small velvet box from the inside pocket of his coat, and the simple movement drew every eye in the conservatory toward his hand. The rain continued its gentle rhythm above the vast glass ceiling while candlelight shimmered across the polished black case. No one spoke. Even the servants seemed to forget to breathe. Grant looked first at Lillian rather than at the crowd surrounding them. There was no triumph in his expression, no desire to embarrass those who had wronged her. There was only quiet certainty. He stepped toward the marble staircase overlooking the conservatory floor until every guest could see him clearly beneath the glow of the hanging chandeliers. His calm voice carried through the silence without effort. This evening was never intended to be a parade of eligible ladies competing for my attention. Curious whispers immediately faded again. Grant continued. The decision everyone believed remained unfinished was completed long before tonight began. He opened the velvet box. Resting inside upon dark silk was a ring that had belonged to his mother, its single sapphire surrounded by delicate diamonds that reflected countless points of candlelight beneath the glass dome. Several older guests recognized it instantly. Lady Wexford placed a trembling hand over her heart. The Ashford heirloom, she whispered almost to herself. Grant nodded slightly. My mother wore this ring until the day she passed. She once told me that a title could be inherited, but the heart required to honor it never could. She believed the greatest strength inside any great house was not wealth or influence. It was character. His gray eyes found Lillian once again. 6 weeks ago I watched Miss Brooks carry food through freezing rain without expecting gratitude. I watched her protect families who had nothing to offer in return. I watched her uncover dishonesty without seeking reward. Tonight I watched her stand alone beneath ridicule, refuse to answer cruelty with cruelty, and defend her honor without asking anyone else to fight her battles. Every word settled deeper than the last. Madeline Crane remained perfectly still, though the color had disappeared from her face. Rebecca quietly lowered her eyes. Owen Prescott looked toward the closed doors as though wishing the estate gates had never been locked. Grant closed the distance between himself and Lillian. He stopped only a few feet away, holding the open ring box without extending it toward her. I chose Miss Brooks before the first guest entered Belgrave tonight, he said clearly enough for every corner of the conservatory to hear. I chose her before the first glass of wine was poured. Before a single cruel word was spoken. Before anyone believed they could decide her worth by humiliating her. A stunned silence followed. The room that had laughed only an hour earlier now seemed unable to find even a whisper. Grant turned briefly toward Madeline and the assembled guests. Some of you believed status alone determined who deserved respect. Tonight you have witnessed the opposite. Respect reveals itself through conduct, especially when no advantage can be gained from it. He faced Lillian once more, his expression softening. There is one misunderstanding I must correct before this evening ends. He lowered himself onto one knee, not as a performance for the crowd, but with quiet humility directed only toward her. Gasps echoed beneath the towering glass roof. Lillian instinctively took a small step backward, overwhelmed by the unexpected moment. Grant looked up at her with calm sincerity. Miss Brooks, I have already chosen you within my own heart. But that choice has never belonged to me alone. He gently closed the velvet box without offering the ring. I will not ask whether you wish to become the Duchess of Belgrave. A title should never be the reason for a promise. Instead, I ask only one question. His voice grew softer, though somehow every person still heard it clearly. After everything you have endured tonight, after every lie spoken against you and every truth you defended with your own courage, would you someday allow me the privilege of earning your trust? Lillian looked into his eyes as the conservatory remained wrapped in complete silence, realizing that the greatest decision before her had nothing to do with a sapphire ring, a noble title, or the countless witnesses surrounding them, but whether she could place her future into the hands of a man who had chosen to honor her long before the world ever knew her name. Lillian stood in complete silence while the sapphire ring rested inside the closed velvet box between them, and for several long moments the only sound beneath the towering glass roof was the gentle rhythm of rain against the conservatory windows. She looked at Grant Ashford not as the Duke of Belgrave, not as one of the most powerful men in Derbyshire, but simply as the man who had chosen to ask for her trust instead of demanding her gratitude. Slowly she reached forward, not for the ring, but for his outstretched hand. "Please stand, Your Grace," she said softly. "A man who has shown me this much respect should not remain on one knee waiting for an answer born from emotion alone." Grant rose without hesitation, his expression calm and patient. Lillian continued, her voice steady despite the countless eyes fixed upon her. "If I accepted your proposal tonight only because you defended me, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I married from gratitude instead of conviction. That would not be fair to either of us." A quiet understanding appeared in Grant's eyes. He nodded gently. "Then tell me what would be fair." Lillian smiled for the first time that evening, a smile untouched by bitterness or triumph. "Walk beside me until I know that the man who stood beside me tonight is the same man who will stand beside me when there is no audience, no scandal, and no reason for applause." Grant's answer came without hesitation. "That is exactly the future I hope to earn." A warmth spread through the conservatory that no fireplace could have created. Lady Wexford smiled through grateful tears while several older guests lowered their heads, quietly ashamed of how easily they had judged another human being only an hour before. Grant carefully returned the velvet box to his pocket. "Then the ring will remain with me a little longer," he said. "Not because my choice has changed, but because I want the day you accept it to belong entirely to us." Lillian inclined her head with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." Grant turned toward the assembled guests one final time. His voice remained composed, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "The investigation concerning the missing estate funds and the false accusations made tonight will continue according to the law. No family name, including my own, will stand above honesty while I remain responsible for Belgrave." No one objected. The room had already learned that evening that dignity could not be purchased by wealth nor protected by titles alone. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Lady Wexford approached Lillian and gently touched her arm. "I owe you an apology, Miss Brooks. I allowed fear to silence better judgment." Lillian answered with her familiar kindness. "We all see more clearly once truth has time to arrive." Even Madeline Crane paused before leaving. Pride prevented her from offering an apology, yet she could no longer meet Lillian's eyes with the confidence she once possessed. Without another word, she quietly walked toward the waiting carriage, while Rebecca followed in humbled silence beside her. Winter gradually surrendered to spring over the months that followed. The western cottages received the relief funds that had been withheld, the neglected herb garden flourished again beneath Lillian's care, and Belgrave became known throughout the county not for lavish celebrations, but for fairness that reached every tenant and servant alike. Grant visited often, never with grand displays, but with conversations shared beneath the flowering camellias, quiet walks along rain-washed garden paths, and evenings spent planning how the estate might better serve the people who depended upon it. Their friendship deepened naturally until one bright afternoon, beneath the same great glass dome where laughter had once tried to break a gentle heart, Grant opened the velvet box once more. This time Lillian did not ask him to wait. She placed her hand in his with complete certainty, accepting not only the sapphire ring, but the life they had patiently built through trust, respect, and shared purpose. Their wedding was held inside the conservatory, surrounded not only by distinguished guests, but by gardeners, teachers, stable hands, widows, children, and tenant families whose lives had become part of Belgrave's story. White camellias covered the marble where crimson wine had once stained her dress, transforming the place of her deepest humiliation into the beginning of her greatest joy. Years later, visitors often admired the beauty of Belgrave and spoke of the gracious Duchess who treated every person with equal kindness, yet very few knew that her happiest life had begun on the very evening others believed they had succeeded in making her feel small. Some victories are announced by applause, but the ones that endure are born quietly in the hearts of people who refuse to surrender their dignity, because true nobility is never measured by the family into which someone is born, but by the grace they choose to carry when the world gives them every reason to let it fall.